The snow fell in slow, heavy spirals over Ocean Avenue, muting the world to a hush. The road glittered with ice under the dull orange glow of the street lamps, and the wind carried a faint smell of brine from the bay. George Lutz tightened his scarf and stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching into the frozen driveway. He stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the house that rose before them, tall and imposing. White clapboard siding, gleaming in the winter dusk, the twin half-moon windows of the upper floor staring down like unblinking eyes. Even in daylight, the house felt aware. Behind him, Kathy emerged, cradling their youngest, Missy, in one arm, while Danny and Chris bickered half-heartedly over who would carry the dog's water bowl. The sheepdog, Harry, whimpered softly in the back of the truck, his eyes fixed on the house. "Well?" Kathy asked, her breath fogging in the air. She was trying to sound bright, but her voice wavered. George exhaled slowly, watching his own breath dissipate. He forced a smile. "Our high hopes," he said, patting the truck door. Missy squirmed in her mother's arms and said something under her breath. Kathy frowned down at her. "What was that, sweetheart?" Missy tilted her head, her blue knit hat slipping over one eye. "The house doesn't like us." Kathy chuckled nervously and set her down in the snow. "That's just the cold talking." But George wasn't laughing. He stepped onto the porch first, his boots slipping slightly on the icy steps. The house key felt heavier than it should as he turned it in the lock, and the door opened with a reluctant groan, as though protesting the intrusion. The inside air was colder than outside. The children tumbled in after them, arguing about which rooms they wanted. Kathy set down her purse and ran her fingers along the banister, pausing when she felt a sticky residue on the wood. "Probably just polish," she muttered to herself, wiping her hand on her coat. Harry stopped at the threshold, nails scraping against the icy wood. He let out a low growl, tail tucked so far it nearly disappeared. George tried to coax him inside. "Come on, boy, it's warm in here." But it wasn't. The dog backed down the steps, whining. The family moved from room to room, the floorboards groaning underfoot. Every sound echoed just a little too long, hollow and strange, as though the walls were listening. The living room was cavernous, the fireplace dark and yawning. Above it, a heavy wooden mantle was carved with the words, "High Hopes." George snorted and shook his head. "Well, that's what we're here for, isn't it?" Upstairs, the rooms were neatly arranged, but bitterly cold. Danny and Chris immediately began arguing over the biggest bedroom, while Missy wandered into a small room at the end of the hall and stood perfectly still. Kathy followed her. "This one? You want this room?" Missy nodded without turning around. From where she stood, Kathy could see her daughter's breath puffing into the air, even though the heating vents were wide open. George called up from downstairs. "Hey, Father Pecoraro says he can come by tomorrow to bless the place. That work?" Kathy raised her voice. "Perfect. Maybe it'll even warm this place up." But Missy murmured softly, just loud enough for her mother to hear. "He won't like the upstairs. That's where they're hiding." That night they sat in the kitchen, eating takeout on the floor because the dining table hadn't arrived yet. The kids were quiet. Even Harry, now tied to a post outside, didn't bark at the passing cars. George poured himself a scotch and stared at the fireplace while Kathy unpacked plates. "You okay?" she asked him. He nodded, then shook his head. "It's nothing. Just tired. Long day." but his eyes kept drifting to the ceiling, to the room directly above them, where he thought he heard faint scratching sounds. And though he couldn't see it, outside, in the dark yard, 2 faint red pinpricks of light glimmered in the tree beyond Missy's window, waiting. When he went to bed, George dreamed of water filling the house, rising to his chest, his neck over his head, until he was floating in blackness. Somewhere far below him, a voice called out through the depths, "We've been waiting for you." Father Pecoraro arrived mid-morning, his breath steaming in the cold. He looked pale, even before stepping inside. George shook his hand. "Thanks for doing this, Father. Place has a feeling to it." The priest managed a weak smile. "It's just a house, but it's good to be thorough." He walked through the rooms, murmuring prayers, sprinkling holy water. When he reached the smallest upstairs bedroom, Missy's, he stopped dead in the doorway. His crucifix swung wildly on its chain. The air became frigid, and his words faltered as something whispered from the corner of the room. Then clearly, "Get out." A sharp wind whipped through the closed windows. The priest clutched his ears as they began to bleed. Dropping his bottle of water and crucifix, he staggered down the stairs without finishing. George tried to stop him, but the priest shook his head violently, backing toward his car. I can't. Not here." He never returned. At exactly 3:15 a.m., George woke. The clock glowed red. Downstairs, the boathouse door creaked open. He crept outside, finding the door swinging on its hinges and an axe lying in the snow. From somewhere far off, a faint voice whispered his name. By the end of the first week, the house refused to warm up. The furnace groaned, but the room stayed bitterly cold. George chopped wood obsessively, muttering to himself. Kathy woke one night to find him standing in the yard at 3:15, shirtless, hacking at the frozen ground. Inside, Missy began speaking to Jody. "She's a big piggy," she explained. "She has red eyes. She said you don't like her." On the 8th night, George found the crawl space, no bigger than a coffin, hidden behind basement shelves. It was painted blood red. When he crouched to look inside, he felt something looking back, and the air smelled of earth and copper. Kathy began waking up with deep bruises. She dreamed of drowning in black water, of cold hands pulling her down. One morning, George found her standing in the hallway naked, covered in scratches. When he touched her, she screamed and bit his hand. Missy laughed one night. George followed her gaze to the window and saw 2 glowing red eyes glaring from the tree outside. He ran into the yard, axe in hand, but the snow was untouched. In the morning, the window frame was gouged with claw marks. Kathy began talking to her reflection. Late one night, George found her in the bathroom, staring into the mirror, whispering in a voice not her own. When he called her name, she didn't answer, but the reflection smiled at him. Rooms began to stink of sulfur and rot. At dinner, the scent of rotting meat would fill the air, then vanish. One morning, hundreds of flies swarmed the upstairs windows, despite the snowstorm outside. On the 15th night, black sludge dripped from the walls. It pooled on the floor, sticky and warm, smelling faintly of blood. They called a plumber. He arrived, took one look at the basement, and left without a word. He crashed his truck into a ditch 10 minutes later. George became withdrawn. He stopped shaving, stopped eating. At night, he muttered in Latin, wandering the halls with the axe. His eyes were dark hollows. On the 17th night, Kathy levitated 3 feet above the bed. Her arms hung limply at her sides, eyes rolled white. When George touched her, she fell to the mattress, gasping, her lips blue. Fresh snow fell. In the morning, the yard was crisscrossed with cloven hoofprints, circling the house endlessly, but with no start and no end. Missy said, "Jody walked around last night. She was checking the locks." Kathy invited a psychic medium. He entered the red room, placed his hands on the floor, and immediately collapsed, screaming. He fled the house mid-ritual, leaving his candles burning behind him. George dreamt of drowning every night. One morning he saw it, a massive face pressed outward from the basement wall, smiling faintly, its eyes like coals. He swung his axe at the wall, but it bled where he struck. The children began sleeping face down, just like the DeFeos. Missy hummed lullabies in a dead language no one recognized. Her dolls would appear in strange places, dangling from the rafters, or sitting in the red room. On the 27th night, the house groaned like a sinking ship. The floors buckled, walls cracked. From somewhere deep inside, a guttural voice rose. "We are waiting." At 3:15 a.m., the red room door creaked open by itself. Voices poured from the crawl space, dozens, layered, pleading, "Murder me again." The air stank of blood and bile. The house erupted. Doors slammed and locked. Windows shattered inward. Black bile gushed from the ceilings, drenching everything. The children lay paralyzed in their beds, eyes wide in silent screams. Kathy levitated again, her body twisting, her hair stiff with blood. George smashed the bedroom door with his axe, shouting her name. Barefoot and bleeding, George dragged Kathy and the children into the snow. Behind them, the house howled, a long, hollow, inhuman roar that echoed through the trees. When he looked back one last time, the windows glowed faint red, and he could swear it was smiling. The family never returned. The house stood silent again, watching the empty street. But when the neighbors woke the next morning, the yard was covered in fresh hoofprints circling the house, and from the boathouse came the faint sound of an axe striking wood.